Hello, Sarah of SEK Handmade here, and welcome to Swatch and Learn, where we'll be slowing down and creating swatches with the simple purpose of learning. This is episode 2, and today we'll be comparing 3 yarn weights and using 1 hook. Let's go. Let's start by talking about our tools. For this Swatch and Learn, we are going to make 3 swatches again, and this time we're going to use 1 hook and 3 types of yarn. The variation in this Swatch and Learn is the weight of the yarn that we're going to use. I have chosen a fingering weight yarn, a DK weight yarn, and a worsted weight yarn. In my attempt to be scientific, I have chosen yarns that were already in my stash. I do not want you to feel like you need to go out and purchase more yarn to do these swatches and learn exercises unless you really want to. No judgment there either. But I tried to pick things that were already in my stash. And to be as scientific as possible, I chose yarns that had the most similar fiber content to each other. And since I went with things that were in my stash, you're going to notice it's not a perfect match. They do not have the exact same fiber content, and that is totally okay. So let's start with my finest yarn here. For my fingering weight yarn, I chose Stroll fingering weight yarn. This yarn has 231 yards for every 50 grams. And then it is 75% fine superwash merino wool and 25% nylon. Every single one of my yarns for this Swatch and Learn contains wool. That's their similar factor here in varying degrees. So that's my fingering weight yarn. You can choose whatever fingering weight yarn you would like. Next, for my DK weight yarn, this one was kind of my my starting point because honestly I don't own a lot of DK weight yarn. So I grabbed the one that I knew I had and then kind of picked my other yarns to match along with it, which I recommend you doing too if you're going to pick some other yarns. So I chose Gloss DK weight yarn here, and this yarn has 123 yards per 50 grams, and it has 70% merino wool, which is very similar to the 75% wool in the Stroll. Of course, keeping in mind that there are lots of different kinds of wool and different types of wool behave differently, so that's a factor. And then it has 30% silk, which is super fancy in my mind. So that's my DK weight yarn. Again, any DK weight yarn you have, all about, I really want Swatch and Learn to be about having fun and learning and relaxing into the learning. So please don't stress about which yarns you choose. My last one I'm going to show you here is going to show you how I have not stressed about this. My last one I chose is Mighty Stitch. This is one of my few worsted weight yarns that I have that actually has wool in it, which is why I chose it. It has 208 yards for every 100 grams, and it is 80% acrylic and 20% superwash wool. So this ratio of lots of acrylic to a little bit of wool is the opposite of my other two, which had a lot of wool and a little bit of something else. So that definitely has an effect on the yarn. And so that's just something to be aware of. Not anything to stress about. No stress here, all relaxation. And then for my hook, I just picked a good middle of the road hook that I really like to use. That would be appropriate and hopefully not too much of a pain to work with for any of the 3 weights of yarn. And so I chose a G hook, which is a 4mm hook. And again, if you don't have a G, pick something else and see what happens. It's all for the fun and the relaxation. For my first swatch, I'm going to go ahead and start with my fingering weight yarn. I've decided to keep this swatch super simple. So I have been working on some patterns with lots of double crochets in them, and I have been loving the groove of the double crochets. So we are going to make all of our 3 swatches out of double crochets. Double crochets are a 1 stitch repeat, so it's a multiple of 1, and then whether you choose to chain 2 chains or 3 chains at the beginning of each row of double crochets, you're going to choose either a multiple of 1 plus 2 if you like to chain 2, or a multiple of 1 plus 3 if you like to chain 3. For your swatches, again, I'm going to recommend that you keep the number of stitches consistent to have some size comparison. That's really helpful. And your swatch can be whatever size you want. I do recommend kind of middle of the road. A really tiny swatch isn't going to give you the same kind of information as a larger swatch. And if you want to go all in and make a giant swatch, I say go for it. Whatever you are comfortable with. So I am choosing to do 20 stitches. So I am going to chain 20, and then I always do a chain 2 at the beginning of my rows of double crochet. So I'm going to do 20 plus 2. So I've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 for my turning chain. And then I'm going to go to the 3rd chain away from my hook and work my first double crochet. How many chains away from the hook you go depends on if you are a chain 2er or a chain 3er. So whichever you prefer is what you'll do. And then you can see if you are someone who learned the very traditional way of working into the front of your chains for crocheting your stitches, you might notice I do this a little differently. I like to work into the back bump of my chains, and I will put, I'm not going to link to how to do a double crochet because I think that's something, it's pretty basic, but I will link, I do have a video on how to work into the back bump of your chain. The reason I do it is totally aesthetic. It gives this really nice braided edge to your work that matches the top edge of your work. And the perfectionist in me really loves that matchy of the top and the bottom. So I am going to work a square-ish swatch after I get down my row here, and I hope you are swatching along with me. If you are not, I'm going to speed up my swatch making so that you don't have to sit and watch all of my stitches in actual time. If you are swatching along with me, I highly recommend that you pause the video while we create our swatches. And I have listed in the description below some things that you might enjoy watching while you work your swatch. So I will keep moving on my swatch and we will meet back here when it's done. All right, guys, real life here. I am swatching these right as you're watching along. So you saw me drop my hook. You saw me get a couple knots. Totally fine. Happens to everyone. So I wanted to set this down and see. I think that gives me about a square. Again, we're being relaxed here, so it doesn't have to be perfect. So that's what I'm going to do for my first swatch. I'm going to clip my yarn, pull it through, and let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 rows of double crochet. So that is my swatch with my fingering weight yarn. Next, I'm going to swatch with my DK weight yarn. I'm going to swatch with my DK weight yarn and the same hook. So I'm still using a G 4mm hook. To be consistent, oh, there's my end. I want to use the same number of stitches and the same number of rows to help me best compare the two, well, really the 3 types of yarn. And you're going to see again, this little ball of yarn is going to wiggle wobble all over the place while I work. So I'm going to do a chain of 20 again. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And since I chain 2 with my double crochets, I'm going to chain 2 more for a total of 22, 21, 22. And then I'm going to work into that 3rd chain. Again, personal preference that I work into the back bump of each chain. And again, you can check out the tutorial below if you would like to learn how to do that, if that's not something you do. I've definitely had people tell me, well, that's just how I learned how to do it, which is lovely. That is not just how I learned to do it, though. All right, so again, goodness sakes, again, I'm going to work down my chain until I have my 20 double crochets. And then to be consistent with my fingering weight swatch, I am going to repeat until I have 9 rows of double crochets so that we can compare not just the look of the stitches and not just the drape of the yarn, but also I'm curious to compare size. Swatching for a project, you're aiming for a certain size, right? You want your hat to be a grown-up hat and not a toddler hat if you're shooting for a grown-up size, or you want your sweater to fit you or the person you're making it for and not end up like super giant or super small. So when you swatch for a project, you're aiming for a certain size. That's obviously not what we're doing here, but I think practicing like we're doing here just for the fun of it, and seeing like how the difference in thickness of these yarns changes the size of your swatch is really educational, because if you are not able to get the exact yarn that a designer uses, which is very common. I remember when I first started knitting, because I knit first, and I buy books and I go looking for the yarn that the designer had used, and a lot of times I either found that it was way out of my price range. When I started knitting, my husband was a graduate student and I was an elementary school teacher, and an elementary school teacher in Arizona, which at the time I think was like 48th in pay for their teachers. So we weren't making a lot of money there. And so I could not afford more expensive yarns. And the other thing is that a lot of times I would find that yarns that designers had used, if the book was more than, a year or two old, a lot of times those yarns would be discontinued. So you have to make substitutions pretty regularly, I think, for designs or for projects. And so having some knowledge of how the weight of the yarn affects your gauge is really invaluable, I feel, because even yarns, and maybe we'll do a swatch and learn with all yarns that are called a certain weight of yarn. I don't know, I tend to find worsted to have the widest range, but there are ranges in every yarn weight. But even yarns that are designated the same weight, there's a variety in actual thickness of the yarn. So swatching just for fun and seeing how those different weights affects the size of your swatch, I think can be invaluable. And also way more fun to experiment with these things when there's no pressure of messing up your garment by having your gauge off. And that's what this is. This is just for fun and to experiment and to see and to learn, of course. All right, I will stop my yammering and I will speed this up, and we'll see you here when the swatch is all done. Remember, I am making the same number of stitches and the same number of rows in each swatch so that I can have the one thing that's changing be the type of yarn that I'm using. So let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yay! That is swatch number 2. Then with the DK weight yarn, and I have one more swatch to go. My final yarn weight that I am going to use is a worsted weight yarn. I am using Mighty Stitch for this. And again, I am going to do exactly, or as close to exactly, as I did before. I am human and not perfect. I'm going to chain 20. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and then work back into that 20th chain. I was thinking as I was doing my last swatch about turning chains and a preference for number of turning chains. And what I was thinking was that I think the number of turning chains you do is more of a personal preference, and I think that a swatch like this would be a great place to play with turning chains. You know, if you learned from your crochet teacher when you first learned that a double crochet takes 3 turning chains, and you've been using 3 turning chains your whole crochet career, but you find that it doesn't give you a nice edge, play around with that. See if doing 2 turning chains gives you a flatter edge. And that's the purpose of changing the number of turning chains, is just to make sure that, or just to try to achieve the most even edges to your project possible. There's a little imperfection in the yarn there, and since this is just a swatch, I'm not going to mess with it. If I were working on a project, I might cut that out, but nope, not for a swatch, just for learning. The other thing I was thinking about is these swatches are a great place to try something new, like working into the back bump. So I hope you take the opportunity, since there's, you know, this is all about learning and less about meeting the perfect gauge, to kind of play with those kinds of things and enjoy just seeing what happens. I am going to go ahead and speed this up, and I'll meet you back here when I have my 9 rows. There, I believe, is my 9th row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yes. So So snip that guy. And that is my third swatch. Let's compare. I have my 3 swatches complete. Each of them is 20 stitches wide and 9 rows tall. And I think it's fun just to kind of look at them all together. They were all worked with a USG, which is a 4mm hook, and 3 different weights of yarn: worsted, DK, and fingering weight yarn. The first thing I'd love to do is stack them on top of each other and get a comparison. Now, you can see, even if you just look at my yarns lined up right next to each other, my worsted and my DK were not that far off from each other as far as yarn weight. When you add the fingering into the mix, it's easy to see. Come on now. It's easy to see that the fingering weight yarn is quite a bit lighter. And I know you're going to notice that in the swatch size. You can see the worsted and the DK weight swatches are very similar in size, and the fingering weight swatch is quite a bit smaller, and that has to do with the thickness of the yarn. So I think one of the cool things to learn here is, if you're working on a project and it calls for a worsted weight yarn, and you're finding that with your worsted weight yarn, you're not meeting gauge, trying out a DK weight yarn might be worth a try, because these 2 swatches are not that different in size. And when you look at, now part of that has to do with the way I crochet. Always there's a human factor in there, but you can see the difference in row height when you line them up is pretty minimal. And if you look at, I can line up the stitches here. You look at lining up the stitches again, there's not a super significant difference. Now, this weight is very different. I would not, well, I guess I shouldn't say I wouldn't, but interesting to compare the size of these 2 swatches versus the fingering weight swatch. And I think this is a good indicator of why you can't pick up a sweater pattern that's designed in DK or worsted and say, I'm just going to make it in fingering. It will be a different fabric and a different size if you just did the exact same stitches in your fingering weight yarn. It's not going to work out to be the exact same size the designer made. Now, this does not mean that if you are quite adventurous that you can't take a sweater that's written for 1 weight yarn and change the weight of the yarn. You just have to be ready for an adventure and for the fact that it may take several tries to get the garment you're really looking for. So the stitch sizes are different depending on the weight of yarn, with a more significant difference between these 2. I think the stitch definition, I don't know what I think about the stitch definition. I think it is similar between these 2 because they are similar weights of yarn. I think the stitches are looser and airier. Let me see if I can show you. If you can see, looking at the table through that swatch, this swatch is a lot more open. The stitches are. There's more space between the stitches than with, especially if you're comparing this guy. And double crochets are a more open stitch because there's more distance between the rows, but there's not as much distance in my worsted weight swatch as my fingering weight swatch. The texture, I think it's fairly similar. Maybe a little more texture as you go up in each size of yarn. So the stitches maybe get a little looser because you've got a larger hook size compared to the yarn weight, as opposed to a smaller hook size compared to the yarn weight. It makes for tighter stitches and pops the texture a little more. As far as drape goes, I'll be honest, I think it's a little bit of a tough comparison because the fiber content is different between the three of these. Ideally, to compare drape, it would have been great to have all the same fiber content. Fiber content? I don't think so. Fiber content for your Mighty Stitch. This is a super drapey yarn, and that has to do with the fiber and what it's made out of. I would say actually my DK weight yarn, which is 70% wool and 30% silk, actually has less drape to it. It holds the shape I fold it into a little better than my worsted weight yarn, and I think that all has to do with fiber content. The fingering weight swatch is super drapey, and again, that's partly fiber content, but also partly that the comparison of the hook size to the yarn size is different. A larger hook as compared to the yarn size. So very, very interesting. Thank you so much for joining me today. Whether you created your own swatches or watched, I hope you found it very informative. I would love to know in the comments below, if you did swatches, what yarn you used for your swatches and what your impressions were of your swatches. If you did swatch especially, I would like to encourage you to get a little notebook and make some notes about your swatches. This information could be really invaluable when it's time to pick yarn for that next special project. Thank you so much for joining me today. I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications, like this video, and share it with a friend that you think might find it helpful. There are lots of great links in the description below, including a link to join my newsletter if you're interested in getting all the information about what's going on at SEK Handmade, as well as premier access to patterns and the best discount code. Thank you so much for joining me today. Happy swatching and happy crafting!